안녕하세요. I'm not finished. 반갑습니다. Chaoyang 컨선월드와이드 CEO Dominic MacSorley 입니다. Okay, thank you. As CEO and President of Alliance 2015, I am delighted to welcome you to the Korean launch of the Global Hunger Index. This launch has particular significance here in Korea, a country that has its own history of famine and overcoming famine. And like Ireland, Koreans know what hunger is. It has bred an empathy that has forged Korea and Ireland's commitments to tackling hunger on the global stage. And I think we really share a unique bond between the Irish and the Koreans. And despite the vast geographic differences, the connection between Ireland and Korea has grown deeper. And I have to say this is greatly facilitated by the diplomatic missions from both of our countries. And the establishment of the Concerned Korea office was greatly facilitated by Ireland's mission here. So I'm really delighted to be followed by the Irish Ambassador, Julian Clare. And I also particularly want to make note and acknowledge the kind of support that we've been having from all of the Korean authorities, including Mr. Jin Ko-young from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think this is the beginning of a very deep and important relationship for concern. Very briefly, we have been doing the Global Hunger Index in partnership with a German NGO, Welthungerhilfe, and the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is based in Washington. And this is now the 12th year. So we have the ability to look over the data and look at the progress. In 2015, we chose a particular theme, and that was the impact that conflict is having on hunger, which illustrated clearly that countries at war are the countries that had just come out of conflict or had come out of conflict a number of years were experiencing the highest levels. And I think you don't need to look too far even to look at the Syrias and the Sudans to see where that is evident. Last year we looked at what is it going to take to get to global, to the target of zero hunger, and some policy recommendations. This year very specifically, we're looking at the impact of inequality. And the reality is, some people have said is that hunger doesn't discriminate. Well, it does, and disastrously so. And the greatest impact is on women and girls, who account for 60% of the world's hungry. A shocking statistic. But the article, Naomi Hussein, in the introduction, she looks at power and the global food systems. And she particularly points to the fact that 70% of the 100 biggest firms who are involved in food processing, 77% of the world's sales go through these. And the question is really, what role, if any, can and should they be having in mitigating hunger? But more specifically, the important part of the Global Hunger Index is really the data and the map, which tells us today where each countries are going. And we will have a presentation shortly on that. But very briefly, what it is telling us is that in 2016, 51 countries are categorized as serious. And this is Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, all of which has made developments but are still highly vulnerable. One of those countries is North Korea. And North Korea has, since 2000, steadily and slowly improved its position, but it is still ranked as serious in terms of food security. And the population remains highly vulnerable and highly fragile. And particularly in this political uncertainty, it is having an impact on the ability of people to feed themselves. There are 13 countries, there are 8 countries which are listed as alarming or extremely alarming, and 7 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, many of those are countries that are caught up in conflict. Central African Republic, Chad, and these now, conflict has become the key driver. There are actually 13 countries where we don't have sufficient data. In other words, the 4 indicators, we don't have all of the information for those. We have probably 2 or 3, and we have additional information, but it's not yet at a point where we can actually provide that level of data. But in truth, you don't really need the data to tell you there's a problem. One of those countries is South Sudan. And on February the 20th this year, we woke up to a headline that shouldn't have happened. And that was that famine had been declared in 2 parts of South Sudan. And when famine is declared, it means that children have already started dying. The criteria for famine is very clear. But households have already suffered a loss of food. Populations have already been displaced. Cattle and livestock has already been sold. So a famine is a declaration of a failure. But unlike genocide, there is no formal UN response required. A declaration of famine is a cry for help, and it should, in fact, mobilize global attention. And yet, on February the 20th, the biggest news story at that time was the fake news story from Donald Trump on Sweden. And I think the other big news story was Brexit. Now, it was bigger news in certain countries. It was big news in Ireland. It was probably bigger news in Korea because we understand what famine is. But it's not just South Sudan. It's Yemen, it's Nigeria, and it's Somalia. And we have an unprecedented level of 20 million people that are close to or on the edge of what's classified as famine. And we've never had this level of 4 potential famines in 1 year. So 20 million people potentially suffering starvation is not fake news. It's very real news. And I think the Global Hunger Index is not just something that points to the problem. What it is also trying to do is point to the solutions. Highlight where is it that we're winning the battle? What are the conditions that are required to ensure that countries, and there are many countries that are making progress. I do think we live in a very strange world. I mean, we live in a world where news items stay for 2 seconds and then move on. And I think as NGOs, we have a responsibility not just to talk about data and statistics, because that is critically important, but to talk about the social consequences of what hunger and starvation means. And I think once you see a child die from starvation, it does change you. And it makes you angry, and it makes you feel that you are compelled to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Because in truth, it is preventable. So I think we have to do a better job. And I think we also need to look at the impact, because I remember very clearly I was in Ethiopia, and Concern, with the support of Irish Aid, had extended its community therapeutic care program, taking it from feeding centres right out into the villages. We brought the treatment of malnutrition to the doorsteps of mothers, which was a very effective way. And still, some mothers refused to come into the village and unwrap their skinny baby in front of the other mothers. Why? Because they were consumed by shame and by guilt that they would be judged as failing mothers. And so shame and self-esteem and a lack of confidence go alongside the physical side of hunger. And this erodes people's ability. And I think we need to talk about that and ensure that the public, because my firm belief is when the public knows there is a problem and they know that there is a solution, they back that. Finally, let me just say, George Bernard Shaw, because we like to quote Irish playwrights, once said, "The essence of inhumanity is not hatred, it is indifference." And the truth is, if we fail to act on the suffering of others, we're not only denying their humanity, we're eroding our own. But I have to say, this room, I don't see indifference, right? In the meetings we've had with the Irish government, in the meetings we've had with the Korean government, I don't see indifference. I see ambition. I see a desire and a willingness and a commitment to meeting the goals that we set out 2 years ago in New York, when 194 nations stood up and made a promise to the world that we would eliminate poverty and eliminate hunger. And I think we should remember, they aren't just promises. They really are. If you look at the goals, we don't use the word rights, but in fact they are rights. They are rights to food, rights to shelter, rights to a job, rights to water, rights to protection. And if we think of them as rights, we will move from aspiration to obligation. I want to thank you for coming here today. I want to thank you for staying engaged, not just with concern, but I think with the international world. And I look forward to your questions later. Thank you very much.